The ransom arrived while I was still tied to a chair beneath the abandoned customs house, blood drying against my collar and one eye swollen nearly shut. The kidnappers expected screaming, bargaining, maybe prayer, but none of that came because the man reading the royal response had started laughing. Princess Aurelia had accepted every demand within 43 minutes. 2 eastern provinces, half the emergency treasury, 3 military cipher books, and the names of our agents inside the Carson Dominion. I stared at the ceiling and understood that the woman I had served for 6 years had just traded a kingdom for my breathing body. My name is Lucian Vale, and until that night I believed diplomacy was the art of preventing powerful people from making emotional decisions with other people's lives. I had negotiated prisoner exchanges, border taxes, succession disputes, and one marriage treaty that nearly ended with 2 kings drawing swords across a dinner table. None of those crises frightened me as much as Aurelia's answer. She had not delayed, consulted the Crown Council, or demanded proof that I was alive. She had simply paid whatever price appeared beside my name. 3 days earlier, Belhaven had been crowded with banners from Ardalan and Carson, each side pretending the peace conference was built on trust instead of exhaustion. I arrived before sunrise with 6 locked cases of treaty drafts and found Aurelia waiting in the negotiation hall, already dressed, already reading the briefing notes I had finished after midnight. She looked composed enough to be carved into a coin, with silver blonde hair pinned beneath a narrow crown and blue eyes that rarely revealed how quickly her thoughts moved. The moment she saw the bandage on my writing hand, she dismissed 2 ministers and demanded to know who had hurt me. I told her it was a paper cut from the Maritime Annex. She took my hand anyway, turned it beneath the window light, and examined the shallow line like an assassin had missed my artery by a breath. Chancellor Rivek of Carson watched from across the chamber with open amusement. Aurelia noticed his expression and spent the rest of the morning dismantling every proposal he offered, 1 clause at a time, until his own delegation stopped looking at him. That was how she protected me in public, elegantly enough that nobody could accuse her of doing it. Her attention had once seemed harmless. Aurelia remembered how I took tea, which corridors aggravated my old knee injury, and the exact date my mother died even though I had mentioned it only once. She sent a physician to my apartment before I admitted I was sick, replaced a driver who took a corner too quickly, and arranged my schedule so I was never required to dine alone with foreign envoys. I thought she was precise because rulers had to be precise. I did not ask why her precision sharpened whenever another woman knew something about me that she did not. Captain Mara Soren asked the first dangerous question. She commanded the palace guard detail assigned to Belhaven and had known me since we were both poor scholarship students at the Royal Academy. During the opening reception she pulled me aside, glanced toward Aurelia, and asked whether I had noticed the princess watching every person who touched my sleeve. I joked that Aurelia watched everyone. Mara answered that the princess had not looked away from me once in 20 minutes, not even while signing a ceasefire declaration. Aurelia appeared beside us before I could reply, carrying 2 glasses and smiling with perfect warmth. She offered one to me and none to Mara. Then she informed the captain that the western balcony posts had been left undermanned, though Mara had personally checked them minutes earlier. The message was polite, the accusation invisible, and Mara left because a royal command wrapped in concern was still a command. Aurelia watched her go and asked why my oldest friend needed to speak with me privately. I told her Mara was discussing security. Aurelia's smile remained, but her thumb pressed hard enough against the glass stem to whiten the skin. She asked whether I trusted Mara more than the people assigned by the crown, then immediately softened the question by saying she only wanted me safe. I answered that trust was not a ranking. Her eyes stayed on mine long enough to make the musicians across the room seem suddenly loud. The peace talks began well because both kingdoms were nearly bankrupt. Carson needed grain from our southern valleys, and Ardalan needed access to the river ports Carson had fortified after the last border clash. I drafted a compromise that gave neither side everything and offered both enough to survive the winter. Rivek hated it, which usually meant I had balanced it correctly. Aurelia approved every article except the one requiring me to remain in Carson for 6 months as resident envoy. She crossed that clause out with a black line so thick the nib tore the parchment. When I objected, She said Carson had already failed to protect 3 foreign diplomats in the past decade. Rivek pointed out that 2 had died of illness and 1 had fallen from a horse. Aurelia replied that accidents were simply murders that had not yet found a witness. I rewrote the posting so another envoy would go, and peace moved forward at the cost of a discomfort I refused to name. The kidnapping happened after the 3rd session. A kitchen fire emptied the eastern wing of the conference palace, and a messenger wearing Mara's colors told me Aurelia had been moved to the river gate under attack. I followed because the message included a private emergency phrase only 5 people knew. The carriage waiting outside belonged to the royal household, down to the correct wool markings and wax seal. I noticed the driver's boots were wrong 1 second before a cloth covered my face. I woke inside a moving wagon with iron around my wrists and a copper taste in my mouth. Across from me sat a young mercenary with a scar through 1 eyebrow, holding my diplomatic case as if it contained gold instead of paper. He called himself Nearus and avoided my questions until I mentioned the emergency phrase. His expression changed before he could hide it. Whoever planned the operation had access to the princess's private security codes. The wagon crossed the old customs road and stopped beneath a ruined toll station near the Carson border. There were 12 captors, all wearing mismatched armor over identical gray linen, the usual disguise of soldiers pretending to be bandits. Their leader, Garan Holt, removed my signet ring, cut a lock of my hair, and dictated the ransom terms to a scribe. He demanded enough to cripple Ardalan without asking for the crown itself. That detail told me the objective was not profit but humiliation. I expected Aurelia to stall. Every negotiation lesson I had ever taught her began with time. Verify the hostage, split the demands, force the enemy to reveal urgency. Instead, a courier returned before the candles burned halfway down. Garan read the royal acceptance twice because he assumed he had missed a condition. The only sentence Aurelia added was a warning that if I returned harmed, every person involved would lose more than the bargain had given them. The mercenaries celebrated, but I studied the response paper on the table. Aurelia's signature was genuine, and so was the small crescent mark she used when signing under extreme pressure. Beneath it sat a second mark, almost invisible, shaped like a broken thorn. I had seen that symbol in sealed memoranda from Duke Severin, Aurelia's uncle and chief advisor. Either he had witnessed the signing, or he had designed the entire demand. Severin had governed beside Aurelia since her father's death. He spoke softly, dressed plainly, and built influence by appearing less ambitious than every man around him. He had opposed the peace talks without saying so directly, warning that Carson would interpret compromise as weakness. More importantly, he had spent months telling the council that Aurelia's judgment became unstable whenever my safety was involved. The ransom looked like a test written to prove his argument. I began planning my escape before the celebration ended. The iron cuffs were old, the floorboards had rotted near the drainage wall, and Nearus kept glancing toward the northern window whenever Garan mentioned the Duke. I told him Severin would erase every mercenary who could connect him to the plot. Nearus insisted they had been promised protection, then stopped talking when I asked whether that promise carried a royal seal. Fear worked where loyalty had failed. During the night, I loosened a brass reinforcement from my boot heel and used it to lift the cuff pin. Nearus returned alone with water, found one wrist free, and reached for his knife. I told him the eastern provinces had already been surrendered, which meant Severin no longer needed witnesses or a hostage. A horn sounded outside before he answered, followed by 3 crossbow bolts striking the shutters. Someone had arrived to eliminate the kidnappers. Garan shouted that Carson troops had betrayed them, but the attackers moved with Ardalan formation signals. Nearus cut my second cuff and shoved the diplomatic case into my hands. We crawled through the drainage gap while the toll station filled with smoke and steel. Behind us, men who had expected gold died without understanding they had been hired as evidence meant to disappear. The drainage tunnel opened beneath a frozen canal half a mile away. Nearus had a bolt in his shoulder, and I had no coat, weapon, or horse. We followed the canal south because returning to Belhaven directly would put us on Severin's road. At dawn we found an abandoned mill where Nearest finally admitted the kidnappers had received their orders from a masked priest using the Duke's household cipher. He had copied one payment code in case Garen cheated him. The code was enough to prove conspiracy if I could reach an honest ledger. It was not enough to undo what Aurelia had surrendered. Carson couriers would already be riding toward the eastern forts with signed transfer orders, and our agents would be burning safe houses after learning their names were exposed. I wanted to believe Aurelia had inserted some hidden condition. The absence of one frightened me more than Severin's betrayal. We could not use the main roads, so Nearest led me through charcoal villages and sheep paths known to smugglers. Each place we passed carried news faster than we did. By the second morning, merchants were refusing Ardalan coin because half the emergency treasury had been pledged. By evening, families from Eastmere were moving west under carts piled with blankets. A kingdom can begin collapsing long before an enemy raises a flag. At a roadside shrine, I found a proclamation nailed beside the prayer board. Duke Severin had called an emergency session of the Crown Council to consider temporary transfer of royal authority. The document praised Aurelia's devotion while describing her concessions as proof she could no longer distinguish private feeling from public duty. My name appeared 6 times. Severin was turning my survival into the weapon that would remove her. Nearest suggested we cross into Carson and disappear. I refused because every mile of occupied land would become permanent if Severin controlled the crown. We needed proof of his orders, evidence the ransom had been engineered, and a way into the capital before his council vote. The shortest route passed through the eastern command post Aurelia had just surrendered. That meant walking directly into soldiers who believed I was either dead or worth a kingdom. The fort at Redwater had changed flags when we reached it. Carson troops occupied the walls, but the Ardalan garrison remained inside under terms of peaceful transfer. Weapons stacked and pride bleeding from every face. Commander Ilya Wren recognized me beneath the mud and pulled us through a supply gate before the Carson officers saw. She asked whether the princess had truly given the order. I could not insult her with a lie. Ilya showed me the transfer document. Aurelia had surrendered the fort, surrounding farms, river bridge, and grain warehouses with no expiration date. The signature had been witnessed by Severin and 3 ministers loyal to him. A private note ordered Ilya not to resist because resistance might delay my release. The handwriting was Aurelia's, including the final line, "Land can be recovered. He cannot." Anger kept me upright when exhaustion should have dropped me. I asked Ilya for maps, a horse, and 2 soldiers who could move without banners. She wanted to march on Belhaven, but that would let Severin call the army rebellious. Instead, I showed her a clause buried inside the old border code. Any territorial transfer signed under active hostage coercion required confirmation by the full Crown Council within 10 days. Severin had scheduled the vote for the 9th. That loophole gave us time, not victory. The council could confirm the transfer and remove Aurelia in the same session. Ilya sent one rider to loyal counselors and another to Mara, who had been confined to barracks after the kidnapping. Nearest agreed to travel with me because his copied payment code pointed toward the capital treasury office. He said he was helping to save himself. I accepted the excuse because people often do brave things more easily when allowed to name them selfish. We entered Ardalan's capital through the river aqueduct on the 7th night after my capture. The streets above were full of black ribbons because Severin's office had announced I was presumed dead after the exchange failed. Memorial candles burned outside the foreign ministry where I had worked since I was 19. I stood beneath the stones listening to strangers mourn me, while the man responsible prepared to use my funeral as a campaign speech. Mara met us inside an abandoned map archive wearing servant clothes over chainmail. She struck me across the face before embracing me hard enough to reopen my ribs. Then she handed me Aurelia's private orders from the previous week. The princess had deployed scouts, informants, healers, river patrols, and palace spies across every road. But Severin had redirected half of them and locked Aurelia inside the royal residence under the excuse of protecting her from public rage. Mara also brought something I had not asked for. A key taken from Aurelia's personal secretary. It opened a room beneath the princess's library that no official floor plan recorded. Mara had discovered it while searching for proof Severin was altering correspondence. She warned me that whatever waited inside would change how I understood Aurelia. I told her that understanding had already become a dangerous luxury. The hidden room held no state secrets. It held me. One wall carried maps marked with every route I had traveled in 6 years, from embassy roads to the path between my apartment and my mother's grave. Shelves contained copies of letters I had sent, broken pens I had discarded, a cuff button lost during a winter banquet, and reports on people who had grown close to me. Aurelia had not begun watching after the kidnapping. She had been building a private kingdom around my movements for years. Mara found her own name in a black ledger. Beside it were dates of promotions, injuries, friendships, and 3 assignments that had moved her away from me at moments Aurelia considered dangerous. None of the orders were openly harmful, but the pattern was unmistakable. A translator who had once asked me to dinner had been transferred to an island consulate within a week. A widow who sent me flowers had lost access to court after an invented security concern. I wanted to burn the room, but evidence mattered more than rage. We copied the ledgers, sealed the originals, and searched for anything connected to Severin. Inside a locked drawer, I found correspondence between Aurelia and her uncle from the first hour after my abduction. Severin had urged delay, questioned whether I was still alive, and warned that concessions would destroy her reign. Aurelia replied that she knew the ransom was designed to provoke exactly that outcome. The next letter removed the last excuse I had left for her. Aurelia identified Severin as the likely architect based on the wording, the demands, and the use of a private security phrase. She wrote that she would expose him after I was safe. Until then, she ordered every demand honored without modification because even a small delay might encourage the kidnappers to hurt me. She had recognized the trap and stepped into it with both eyes open. Mara expected me to condemn her. Instead, I sat on the floor among years of stolen pieces of my life and felt something more complicated than disgust. Aurelia had never mistaken the kingdom's value. She had simply valued me above it. That was not ignorance, weakness, or political confusion. It was obsession operating with perfect information. We left the hidden room before dawn and went to the Treasury archive. Nearest used the copied payment code to identify 3 sealed disbursements from Severin's household fund to shell companies controlling the kidnappers' supply wagons. The final payment had been authorized for sanitation services on the night attackers stormed the toll station. Severin had paid to create the kidnapping and then paid again to erase it. This evidence could destroy him if we survived long enough to present it. The council session was 2 days away. Severin controlled the palace entrances, the city guard, and most of the ministers scheduled to testify. We needed Aurelia free, but I refused to place the plan entirely in her hands while she still possessed unilateral power. I drafted a temporary charter inside the archive, transferring emergency decrees, territorial concessions, intelligence disclosures, and treasury withdrawals to a 3-signature authority. The Crown, the Council Speaker, and the Royal Chancellor would all have to agree. Mara read the document and asked who I expected to serve as Chancellor. I wrote my own name. It was not ambition. It was a lock, and Aurelia had already shown she needed one. If she wanted my help restoring the kingdom, she would accept an authority capable of stopping her from sacrificing it again. If she refused, I would expose Severin and leave court permanently after the crisis. Reaching Aurelia required entering the royal residence through an old diplomatic tunnel beneath the winter garden. I had used it once during a siege drill, and Aurelia had later ordered it sealed. The bricks were new, but the mortar had not fully hardened. Mara and Nearest opened a gap while I listened to guards above discuss whether the princess had eaten. She had refused every meal since receiving word that my body had not been found. I entered her chamber alone. Aurelia stood at the balcony in a plain nightdress, hair unpinned, with 3 loaded pistols arranged on the table beside her. She turned before I spoke, as if some part of her had known the exact second I crossed the threshold. For one heartbeat her face emptied completely. Then she crossed the room and struck me. The blow was weak, more accusation than violence. She touched my jaw, shoulders, throat, and wrists in a frantic inspection while demanding to know where I had been hurt. I caught her hands and told her to stop, Relief left her expression so quickly it revealed the fear beneath it. She asked whether I understood what she had done to keep me alive. I laid the hidden room ledger on the table. Aurelia recognized it and became still. I asked how long she had followed me, redirected people around me, copied my letters and kept objects I had thrown away. She answered with a date 6 years earlier, the day I first contradicted her father during a treaty briefing and survived his anger. She said that was when she realized I was the only person in court who spoke to her as if the crown did not make her less human. I told her affection did not excuse surveillance. She said she knew, but knowing had never made the need disappear. Every time I traveled, she imagined receiving news that I had died somewhere beyond her reach. Every person who became important to me felt like a road leading away from her. She had spent years closing those roads quietly enough that I would never notice. Then I asked why she surrendered the kingdom after identifying Severin's trap. Aurelia did not offer a political defense. She said she had pictured me tied in a room while ministers debated percentages, and every argument for patience sounded like a polite way of choosing my death. Provinces could be retaken, gold replaced, codes rewritten, and reputations repaired. There was only one Lucian Vale, and she refused to become a ruler who sacrificed him for a cleaner map. I told her the people of Eastmere were leaving their homes because of that choice. Agents whose names she exposed would never return to their families. Soldiers who trusted her had stacked their weapons under a foreign flag. Aurelia's eyes filled but did not move from mine. She said she would carry every consequence if it meant I remained alive to hate her. That answer was more frightening than denial. I placed the emergency charter beside the ledger and explained the terms. She would remain princess and lead the recovery, but never again could she trade territory, intelligence, or public wealth for me without 2 independent signatures. I would become royal chancellor until the crisis ended, and the council speaker would hold the 3rd seal. If she rejected it, I would still testify against Severin, then leave Ardalan where her agents could not easily reach. Aurelia read the charter twice. Her attention stopped on the clause allowing the chancellor to suspend royal orders involving my detention, travel, correspondence, or personal associations. She asked whether I had written it because I feared she would lock me in the palace. I answered that I feared she had already considered it. Silence followed, and her glance toward the pistols told me I was correct. She moved to the door and turned the key. For one sharp second I believed she had chosen the cage. Instead, she removed the key from the lock and placed it in my palm. Aurelia signed the charter on the table, pressing so hard the ink spread beneath her name. She said if sharing power was the price of keeping me in her life by choice, she would pay that price too. We did not embrace. I called Mara into the room, and Aurelia ordered the loyal household guards released from the lower barracks. Before sunrise, the winter garden filled with officers, clerks, and 2 counselors who had slipped away from Severin's surveillance. Aurelia appeared before them wearing full royal dress, composed again, but the new charter hung from her belt beside the state seal. The people in that room understood something fundamental had changed. Our first problem was the compromised military codes. Severin had already sent copies to Carson, and changing them normally required weeks of distribution. I remembered a dormant emergency system created during the plague years, using church bells and merchant price boards to transmit short numerical sequences. Aurelia dispatched riders to every provincial market with new cipher tables, hidden inside grain manifests. By nightfall, the secrets she had surrendered were expiring faster than Carson could exploit them. The treasury required a different solution. Half the reserve had been transferred as stamped gold bars to accounts controlled by Carson intermediaries. Nearest identified the transport company because Garan had used the same network. We issued a public notice declaring every bar in the surrendered batch evidence in a treason investigation, making banks afraid to accept them. Gold is valuable only when someone believes keeping it is safer than refusing it. Eastmere was harder because foreign soldiers already occupied the forts. The hostage coercion clause allowed us to challenge the transfer, but Carson would not retreat simply because our law disapproved. I sent Chancellor Rivek a private message revealing that Severin had designed the ransom to collapse the peace treaty and blame Carson for the result. Rivek hated being used more than he wanted 2 provinces. He agreed to delay formal annexation until the council vote. Aurelia wanted Severin arrested immediately. I refused because his supporters controlled enough of the guard to turn an arrest into civil war. We needed him to enter the council chamber believing I was dead and Aurelia isolated. Mara spread a rumor that a body matching my description had been recovered from the canal. Nearest delivered forged confirmation through one of Severin's payment brokers. By noon, my own uncle's murderer was preparing a victory speech. Aurelia objected to using my death again, even as a lie. She read every detail of the operation and demanded 3 escape routes, 2 medical teams, and a hidden guard within arm's reach of me during the council session. I approved 1 guard and rejected the rest. She accused me of testing how much authority she had truly surrendered. I told her the charter was not symbolic, and she signed the deployment order through clenched teeth. The Crown Council gathered beneath the painted dome of St. Ara's Hall. Severin stood at the central podium dressed in mourning gray, speaking of duty, sacrifice, and the tragedy of a princess whose heart had overwhelmed her judgment. Aurelia sat behind a screen under supposed confinement while ministers debated whether to strip her emergency powers. My memorial portrait stood beside the witness table. I entered through the public doors before the first vote was called. The chamber broke into shouting. Severin's face did not collapse dramatically. He simply stopped breathing for several seconds and gripped the podium until his rings cut into the wood. I introduced Nearest, presented the treasury codes, and placed Garen's payment records before the council clerks. Mara followed with the altered security orders and the list of assassins sent to erase the mercenaries. Every document carried Severin's cipher, seal, or authorized account. Severin recovered quickly because men who build conspiracies also build explanations. He claimed the records were forged by Aurelia's loyalists and accused me of returning under coercion. Then he made the mistake of ordering the city guard to arrest me before the council had ruled. Half the guards obeyed, half hesitated, and Mara drew her sword between us. The painted hall became one shouted command away from blood. Aurelia stepped from behind the screen without permission. She did not threaten Severin or defend her concessions. Instead, she admitted every surrender in a clear voice and told the council she had knowingly endangered the kingdom to save me. Several supporters looked away, expecting that confession to end her reign. Then she displayed the signed charter and announced that she had already limited her own authority before anyone forced her to do it. Her honesty changed the room more than denial would have. Aurelia said a ruler capable of catastrophic personal judgment should not pretend perfection. She should build barriers strong enough to protect the country from her worst decision. She named me chancellor, appointed Councillor Elian Roque as speaker, and submitted herself to the same emergency rules as every future monarch. Severin's argument depended on proving she could not recognize her flaw. She had recognized it and turned it into law. The council ordered Severin detained pending trial. His loyal guards attacked. Mara met the first officer at the steps, while I pulled the nearest ministers behind the stone benches. Aurelia seized a ceremonial spear from the wall and fought beside her household guard with none of the fragile madness Severin had described. She protected the charter chest before she protected the throne. Severin escaped through the vestry tunnel with 12 soldiers and 2 counselors. He rode east, taking the road toward Redwater and the surrendered forts. By the time we secured the capital, he had declared Aurelia deposed and invited Carson to recognize him as provisional regent. Rivec refused publicly, but foreign commanders near Eastmere began choosing whichever order gave them the most land. The conspiracy had become a border war. We could not retake the east through force alone. Ardalune's army was divided, the treasury damaged, and winter 3 weeks away. I proposed offering Carson the original peace treaty plus limited river access in exchange for withdrawal from the hostage transfers. Aurelia hated rewarding them after they accepted her surrender. I reminded her that recovery meant restoring the kingdom, not satisfying anger. She signed the negotiating mandate after the council speaker approved it. Rivec agreed to meet at Redwater under truce. He arrived with 20 guards and the confidence of a man holding someone else's forts. I brought Aurelia, Mara, and the original treaty draft. Rivec expected the princess to beg for her provinces back. Instead, She placed Severin's letters on the table, proving he intended to restart the war and blame Carson for Lucian Vale's murder. I offered Rivek a choice. He could keep the coerced territories and inherit a permanent war with the United Ardalan, or return them, sign the Balanced River Treaty, and publicly expose Severin as the architect who manipulated both courts. Rivek asked what guaranteed Aurelia would not surrender the same provinces again the next time I was threatened. I showed him the Three-Seal Charter. For once, the thing that limited her power became our strongest diplomatic weapon. Carson agreed to withdraw from 2 forts immediately and hold the third jointly until Severin was captured. The treasury gold would be returned minus transport costs, a humiliation I accepted because pride does not feed displaced families. In exchange, we granted seasonal river access and reopened the grain market. Rivek signed before Aurelia because he wanted the world to see Carson had chosen law over chaos. Aurelia signed because she had learned that saving a kingdom sometimes meant accepting an imperfect victory. Severin took refuge in Blackthorn Keep, an old fortress overlooking the Eastern Pass. He still controlled nearly 2,000 soldiers, several noble families, and the last uncompromised royal printing press. From there he issued proclamations claiming Aurelia had surrendered sovereignty to a common-born lover. The accusation spread because it contained enough truth to sting. I had become chancellor because she could not trust herself where I was concerned. I advised Aurelia to remain in the capital while I coordinated the siege. She refused before I finished the sentence, saying Blackthorn had tunnels, assassins, and men who had already kidnapped me once. I invoked the charter and reminded her military deployment required 3 seals. She obtained the council speaker's approval before I could object. Learning restraint did not make her less relentless. It made her relentless within rules. The march east showed us the cost of her earlier surrender. Burned tax offices lined the roads, families waited for grain wagons, and former agents traveled under false names because their identities had been exposed. Aurelia stopped at every camp and listened without defending herself. Some cursed her. One old farmer threw mud at her cloak, and she did not order his arrest. She promised compensation from her private estate before asking the council to spend public money. At night, she still checked my tent herself. The first time, she claimed she was inspecting perimeter security. The second time, I found her standing outside before dawn, counting the rise and fall of my breathing through the canvas. I told her the charter controlled decrees, not habits, and habits could still destroy what we were trying to build. She asked whether she was forbidden from being afraid. I answered that fear was allowed. Surveillance without consent was not. She gave me the list of every remaining watcher assigned to my movements. There were 31 names across 6 provinces, including innkeepers, messengers, priests, and 1 librarian who had reported which history books I borrowed. Aurelia offered to dismiss them all. I kept 3 as official security contacts and ordered the rest released from service. She watched me burn the private codes, grieving them like bridges I had chosen to cut. Blackthorn Keep could withstand a year-long siege, but Severin lacked enough food for his soldiers and the refugees he had forced inside. I sent letters guaranteeing amnesty to conscripts who opened the lower granary road. Aurelia wanted the officers excluded. We compromised by offering hearings instead of automatic punishment. 3 nights later, a gate sergeant lowered a rope ladder and gave Mara a map of the western wall. The map revealed a chamber beneath the chapel where Severin kept hostages taken from loyal noble families. Among them was Councillor Roke's daughter, which explained why the speaker had begun hesitating over military approvals. Severin sent us a message offering their release if Aurelia dissolved the charter and named him regent. He had finally understood that the law, not the army, was blocking him. His next move would target the person who created it. I doubled my guard and changed tents every night. Aurelia wanted me moved behind the main army lines, but I knew Severin would interpret that as fear and attack the hostages instead. We designed a false command post near the southern ridge and leaked its location through a captured courier. The bait was obvious enough that Severin would suspect a trap, but personal hatred makes cautious men believe they can outsmart what they see. The attack came during a thunderstorm. Severin's soldiers struck the false command post while a smaller team entered camp through a drainage ditch shown on stolen maps. I was in the real planning tent with Mara when the lamps went out. A blade cut through the canvas, smoke filled the space, and someone pressed a pistol beneath my jaw. The kidnapping had begun again, this time without the comfort of surprise. Their leader was Severin himself. He dragged me through the drainage ditch while his men covered the retreat with fire pots. Mara followed but lost us beneath the cliff tunnels. I tried to slow them by collapsing a support beam, and Severin struck me across the mouth with the pistol. He said Aurelia had traded the kingdom once and would do it again because obsession does not learn. It only waits. Inside Blackthorn, Severin locked me in the chapel chamber beside the hostages. He sent Aurelia a final offer. Abdicate, dissolve the charter, surrender the army, and I would walk free before sunrise. This time he broadcast the demand from the fortress walls so every soldier in both camps could hear it. He wanted her choice witnessed. He wanted the kingdom to watch her prove him right. Aurelia came alone to the truce marker carrying the crown. From the chapel slit I could see her silver hair in the rain and the black cloak snapping behind her. Severin stood on the wall with a knife against my throat. She placed the crown on the stone table and asked for the release order. My stomach turned because every safeguard we had built seemed ready to fail under the same pressure. Then Counselor Roke stepped beside her. The charter required his seal and mine for abdication under coercion. Severin demanded Aurelia dismiss him and revoke the law. She said she no longer possessed the authority to do either alone. For the first time, her inability to trade everything for me was not a weakness imposed from outside. It was the promise she had chosen to sign. Severin ordered a soldier to cut my throat. I moved before the blade reached skin, driving my shoulder into the man and using the chain between my wrists to pull him off balance. The hostages attacked the guards with benches, candlesticks, and broken prayer rails. Outside, Mara's team entered through the western granary road, while Ilya's soldiers climbed the rope route. The fortress erupted from within before Aurelia could break the truce line. Severin dragged me toward the bell tower with the pistol pressed into my back. He shouted down to Aurelia that the law had made her powerless to save me. She looked at me instead of him. Weeks earlier she would have offered another province, another treasury, another piece of herself. Now she waited for my signal because shared authority required trust in the person she was desperate to protect. I dropped to one knee. The movement exposed Severin's chest above the parapet. Aurelia drew the small pistol hidden beneath her cloak and fired once. The shot struck his shoulder, spinning him away from me without killing him. Mara reached the tower seconds later and placed a sword at his throat. Aurelia had chosen action over surrender because the law forced her fear to make room for judgment. The fortress gates opened before dawn. Conscripts laid down their weapons, hostages reunited with their families, and Severin was carried to a guarded wagon alive enough to face trial. He looked at Aurelia and told her she had only won because I had chained her crown. She answered that a ruler who refuses necessary limits is already chained by something worse. Then she ordered him taken away without asking whether I wanted revenge. Blackthorn's fall ended the rebellion, but repairing Ardalan took months. We reopened the eastern courts, returned farms seized during the transfer, and paid compensation from the recovered gold. The exposed agents received new identities and pensions, though 3 had died before we could reach them. Aurelia attended each memorial privately. She never asked the families to forgive her. Severin's trial was public. Nearest testified about the kidnapping, Mara presented the altered security codes, and treasury clerks explained the shell payments. I described the ransom response without softening Aurelia's part in it. The court convicted Severin of treason, murder, unlawful war, and conspiracy against the crown. Aurelia refused to decide his sentence alone and submitted it to the full council under the new charter. The council sentenced him to life imprisonment in the island fortress of Varin, far from any border or court. Some nobles demanded execution. Aurelia did not argue for mercy, but she accepted the decision. Severin had built his power by persuading everyone that only one person's will mattered at a time. Letting the law finish him was a cleaner defeat than giving him a martyr's death. The temporary charter was scheduled to expire 6 months after the crisis. Aurelia surprised the court by proposing that most of it become permanent. Territorial transfers, intelligence disclosures, emergency treasury withdrawals, and declarations of war would require multiple seals under every future monarch. The council expanded the measure into a constitutional settlement. Ardalan kept its princess, but no ruler would ever again be able to gamble the country in one desperate signature. My chancellorship became permanent after a vote I tried to avoid. I accepted on the condition that the office could overrule royal commands involving my person only when another counselor agreed. I did not want to become Aurelia's keeper any more than I wanted to remain her possession. Shared authority had to protect both of us from turning fear into law. She signed the final version without changing a word. Mara became commander of the reorganized royal guard. Her first act was to remove every unofficial watcher Aurelia had placed around me. The second was to assign me 2 visible guards who reported to the council, not the princess. Aurelia disliked both decisions and approved them anyway. Mara said that was the closest thing to an apology she expected from royalty. Aurelia and I did not become lovers immediately. She confessed 3 weeks after Blackthorn, standing in the hidden room beneath her library while workers removed the maps and ledgers. She said she loved me with a devotion that had become dangerous long before she admitted it to herself. Then she asked whether I could ever love someone who had measured my life in routes, reports, and locked doors. I told her I already cared for her, which was precisely why I had stayed through the collapse. Care was not enough to erase what she had done. She needed to prove she could live beside uncertainty without converting it into surveillance or sacrifice. She asked how long that would take. I said there was no schedule because trust built to a deadline is only another negotiation. She accepted the answer badly. For several weeks she became painfully formal, addressing me as Chancellor Vale in rooms where we had once argued like friends. I discovered later she had drafted 6 letters asking me to dinner and burned each one before sending it. The restraint was awkward, imperfect, and real. She was learning that not every silence required intervention. The first major test came when Carson invited me to spend 2 months overseeing the river treaty. Aurelia read the invitation at breakfast and set down her cup without speaking. Under the old pattern, she would have found a security objection, transferred another envoy, or created a crisis that kept me home. Instead, she asked whether I wanted to go. I said yes. She approved the mission and did not place hidden agents in my delegation. I verified that with Mara, Nereus, and the Treasury because trust did not mean abandoning caution. Aurelia sent 1 official guard and a sealed letter I could open only if I chose. Inside she had written that every part of her wanted to invent a reason for my return, but wanting was not the same as ordering. I carried the letter for the full journey. Carson tested the treaty aggressively. Rivec delayed grain inspections, river captains ignored toll limits, and local nobles challenged every boundary marker. I resolved most disputes through contracts and threatened arbitration on the rest. Aurelia never interrupted negotiations to ask whether I was safe. She sent ordinary diplomatic updates like any ruler speaking to her chancellor. The absence of pressure felt strange enough that I understood how deeply I had adapted to being watched. A Carson countess named Lisa Marrow became part of the talks. She was clever, direct, and openly amused by the rumors surrounding me and Aurelia. At a public dinner, she asked whether the princess had truly surrendered 2 provinces for my life. I said the story was more complicated. Lisa replied that obsession was rarely complicated to the person receiving its benefits. The comment followed me back to my rooms. I had received protection, influence, and a crown's attention while others paid the price. Rejecting Aurelia completely would not undo the damage, but accepting her without change would reward it. The only path that meant anything was the one we had chosen. Power divided, truth exposed, consequences carried, and affection separated from ownership. I wrote that in my private report and did not send it. Aurelia learned about Lisa because the dinner appeared in official minutes, not because a spy whispered it. Her reply addressed river tariffs, bridge repairs, and grain quotas without mentioning the countess. 3 days later, a second letter arrived with 1 handwritten line asking whether Lisa made me laugh. I answered honestly that she did. Aurelia did not recall me, sabotage the talks, or transfer Lisa to an island. When I returned after 2 months, Aurelia waited in the public arrival hall instead of the private gate she once used to control who reached me first. Mara, ministers, clerks, and my family stood nearby. Aurelia greeted me last. Her hands remained at her sides until I offered mine. That small hesitation affected me more than any speech could have. I visited the hidden room that evening. The walls had been stripped and repainted. Shelves once filled with stolen pieces of my life now held public treaty archives, duplicate charters, and records available to any authorized scholar. Aurelia had preserved one object, the torn pen from our first negotiation, displayed inside a glass case with a label explaining its historical significance. I told her that was absurd. She said compromise did not require destroying every memory. Months passed without another secret order concerning me. Aurelia still noticed when I slept badly, still remembered every injury, and still watched doors when strangers entered. The difference was that she asked before acting. Sometimes she failed and apologized after Mara caught her requesting information she had no right to receive. Improvement looked less like transformation and more like repeated correction. The final constitutional ceremony took place 1 year after the kidnapping. Representatives from every province gathered in St. Ara's hall, the same chamber where Severin tried to remove her. Aurelia placed the royal seal beside the council seal and my chancellor's seal, making the balance permanent. No territory, army, treasury, or intelligence network could be surrendered by one frightened ruler again. The law could not remove obsession, but it could stop obsession from becoming national policy. After the ceremony, Aurelia asked me to walk through the winter garden. She wore no crown, only a blue coat and the narrow silver ring her mother had left her. At the fountain she confessed again, without mentioning destiny, sacrifice, or how much she had suffered. She said she loved me. New love did not entitle her to an answer, and would accept whatever I chose without moving a single guard, minister, or border to influence it. I asked whether she understood why I had waited. Aurelia said she once believed the strength of love could be measured by what someone was willing to destroy for it. Now she believed destruction only proved fear had found power. She had traded a kingdom because losing me seemed worse than failing everyone else. The charter had forced her to learn that protecting me also meant protecting the world I had chosen to live in. That was the answer I needed, not because it erased the past but because it named it without disguise. I told her I loved her too. Aurelia closed her eyes, and the relief on her face was almost painful to witness. She did not reach for me until I stepped closer first. Our first kiss happened beside a frozen fountain with guards deliberately stationed beyond hearing distance. We established rules before announcing an engagement. My correspondence remained private unless I invited her to read it. Her security officers could protect me openly but never report my conversations without a legal reason. I could travel without seeking personal permission, and she could ask for reassurance without manufacturing emergencies. Breaking those rules would pause the engagement until we addressed the cause. Aurelia called the rules unromantic. I reminded her that unconstrained romance had nearly cost us 2 provinces. She admitted the point and added one condition of her own. I had to tell her when danger was real instead of hiding risks because I feared her reaction. That was fair. Control had grown partly in the spaces where both of us concealed what frightened us. Our wedding was delayed until Eastmere's displaced families had returned home and the last compensation claim was paid. Aurelia insisted on that condition herself. She sold 3 royal hunting estates to cover the remaining losses without touching public funds. Families who once cursed her began speaking of the princess who stayed to repair what she broke. Forgiveness remained uneven, but accountability had become visible. On the morning of the wedding, Mara found Aurelia outside my rooms arguing with herself about whether checking on me would violate our agreement. She had already dismissed 2 servants who offered to report what I was doing. Mara made her wait in the hall until I opened the door. Aurelia looked furious, embarrassed, and relieved all at once. I considered it the most honest expression she had ever worn. We married in the council hall instead of the royal chapel. The 3 seals stood behind us as a reminder that our private devotion would never again outrank the country. Nearest attended in an expensive coat he claimed had been confiscated legally. Rivek sent a silver river compass with a note warning that Ardalan diplomacy had become annoyingly difficult. Even Mara smiled during the vows, though she denied it afterward. Aurelia's vow contained no promise to destroy enemies, defy kingdoms, or follow me beyond death. She promised to ask before protecting, listen before deciding, and remain beside me without closing every road that led elsewhere. Mine promised honesty even when honesty frightened her, resistance when fear disguised itself as love, and choice renewed rather than assumed. The words were less dramatic than the ransom she once signed. They were also harder to keep. Years later, people still tell the story incorrectly. They say a princess traded her kingdom for a diplomat. The diplomat returned from death, and love restored everything. The truth is that love nearly destroyed Ardalan because it belonged to someone with enough power to make panic official. We recovered the provinces through law, alliances, evidence, and the willingness to limit the crown. Romance came after the kingdom was safe from becoming collateral again. Aurelia remains possessive in ways no constitution can fully regulate. She notices who stands too close, remembers every compliment I receive, and occasionally asks Mara whether a foreign envoy is married. Mara answers only when the information is relevant to security, which it rarely is. Aurelia complains, then lets the question go. That small act of letting go is something she once considered impossible. I still keep the original ransom response in my office. The paper is creased, stained, and signed with the mark Aurelia used under unbearable pressure. Beside it rests the permanent charter with 3 seals at the bottom. One document proves what she was willing to surrender for me. The other proves what she was willing to surrender in herself so she could love me without destroying everything around us. Aurelia sometimes stands beside me during those lectures. She never interrupts or asks me to soften the account. When I finish, she tells the students that devotion without limits is simply fear wearing ceremonial clothes. Then she takes my hand in front of the room, openly, with no guard tracking where I will go next. The gesture is ordinary now, which is precisely why it means more than the kingdom she once placed at my feet. The night before our 5th anniversary, I found her reading the charter alone beneath the library lamps. She admitted she still dreamed about the customs house and woke convinced I had not escaped. In those dreams she signs away province after province until no country remains. Yet the kidnappers never return me. I sat beside her and reminded her that she no longer had the authority to make that bargain alone, and neither of us had to face fear alone either. She asked whether I ever regretted staying. I answered that staying was not one decision made at a fountain. It was hundreds of decisions made after arguments, missions, mistakes, and ordinary mornings. I could leave and she knew it. She could ask me to remain, and I could say yes without a lock turning anywhere in the palace. That freedom was the foundation of every answer I gave her. Aurelia leaned against my shoulder and said the kingdom had once felt like an acceptable price because she believed love had to defeat everything else. Now she understood love had to live among everything else. Duty, friendship, law, grief, borders, and people whose names would never appear in our story. She had not become less intense. She had learned intensity was not permission. Outside the library, bells marked midnight across a capital that still belonged to its people. Eastmere's farms were green again, Carson's ships moved under treaty flags, and Severn's prison island had vanished from political conversation. Aurelia closed the charter and asked whether I wanted tea. She knew exactly how I took it, of course. This time she waited for me to answer before pouring. I said yes, and she smiled without triumph. No kingdom changed hands, no soldiers moved, no letters disappeared, and no rival woke to find her life quietly rearranged. It was only tea shared between 2 people who had survived the worst version of devotion and refused to call survival enough. The princess who once traded everything for my safe return finally understood that my return meant nothing unless I was free to choose where I stayed.